Okay.
Hello, everyone. Now that we have Tom, um, before I give the floor over to him, I really hope everyone enjoyed the film. And I wanted to briefly introduce Tom. Tom Shepard is no stranger to powerful documentaries that shed light on the injustices and discrimination faced by LGBTQ folks. In 2001, Tom produced and directed Scout's Honor, a documentary that focused on the broad-based movement aimed at overturning the anti-gay policies of the Boy Scouts of America. Scouts Honor won the Audience Award for Best Documentary and Freedom of Expression Award at the 2001 Sundance Film Festival, as well as the Grand Prize at the 2001 USA Film Festival, and Best Social Issue Documentary by the Council on Family Relations. Scouts Honor broadcast nationally when it opened documentary series POV's 14th season on PBS. Additionally, in 2011, Tom produced The Grove, which examined the development of the National AIDS Memorial Grove in San Francisco. He also has co-produced and co-directed Knocking, which highlighted the unspoken impact of Jehovah's Witnesses and the impact that they've had on our society and how they've expanded freedoms for all Americans. He directed Whiz Kids, a coming-of-age documentary about 3 teenagers who compete in the Intel Science Talent Search as well. Tom is a researcher and a social activist who sees journalism as the 4th branch of government and believes documentaries are vehicles for social change. In his own words, he makes films to challenge beliefs and raise the voices of those in society whose experiences have been overlooked, misrepresented, or vilified. If viewers can identify and empathize with characters on screen as they are drawn into a story, there is a greater likelihood that misperceptions, stereotypes, and ignorance can give way to deeper understanding and compassion. Before his career in film, Tom worked as an editor at National Public Radio. At NPR, he co-produced Listening to America, an audio documentary on the history of public radio in America. He graduated from Stanford University, where he majored in biology and film, and he currently teaches documentary filmmaking in California and Colorado. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Unsettled's director and producer, Tom Shepard. Tom, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me and having our film, and it's a pleasure to be in this conversation with you all. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know that we're going to be getting a lot of questions. If people could please use the Q&A. I know we just got one, but I wanted to selfishly use this time to get started with a few questions that I had as well. So first off, I wanted to talk a little bit about the selection process. So I can only imagine while you were starting to gather all the information to produce this wonderful film, that it must have been challenging to center in on these 3 stories. So why did you choose these 3 stories? What was so compelling about them to you?
So we started this film back in 2014, and I was at the time volunteering for a refugee resettlement organization in the Bay Area of California. So, and that organization is called Jewish Family and Community Services of the East Bay. And of course, they've been doing, along with a number of other, kind of refugee rights and resettlement organizations, resettlement of refugees in the US for decades and decades. At that time, they got the first grant from the federal government. This was under President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton to actually resettle LGBTQ refugees who were coming through the pipeline. I think maybe there were 2 grants in the US at that time. One was there and one was in New York. And, if you remember back at that time, legally, LGBTQ civil rights was accelerating pretty quickly in this country and in many Western countries. So we had marriage equality, which was kind of steamrolling its way to the Supreme Court. Not so in many other parts of the country. At the same time, I was reading stories about gay men who were being thrown off of buildings by extremist groups in the Middle East. reading horrific stories about lesbian corrective rape in many countries in Africa, and really just a kind of a state-sponsored homophobia and persecution against people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So there was just sort of this dissonance between what was happening in the West and what was happening in other places. And I think, I'm a gay man myself. I'd been living in San Francisco for 20 some years and was looking around and just feeling some complacency in the community. And also, like, I couldn't have even told you at that time what the difference was between a refugee and an asylum seeker. And I was even, doing some volunteer work with refugees. So it felt like maybe a kind of a yeasty moment in time to be able to embark in a kind of a longitudinal project that would really try and humanize the lived experiences of these folks who were coming here. And that's, of course, we didn't realize it was going to take, 4 or 5 years, but in a way, I think there was some benefit to that, certainly in building the rapport and the trust with the folks that I found, that we met at that time.
That's wonderful. And I'm glad you mentioned that it was 5 years. All of this that we just watched took place over a period of 5 years. Another big question that I wanted to bring up was, you focus on obviously the realities of LGBTQ asylum seekers and refugees once in San Francisco, instead of on the journey or really the process of seeking asylum, the process of becoming a refugee. But given that you are so active in that space, I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the complexities that were happening behind the scenes that perhaps you weren't able to capture in this film.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. At the time we were doing research, we were looking both in the literature and also what other films had been made. And there had been films produced about the experience of queer folks in their countries of origin. I mean, there's some more sort of high profile films like God Loves Uganda, but there were 2 or 3 others that had been produced that sort of looked at persecution in the home country. And I think in part because we were starting to see, and of course this has been the case for decades, so this is nothing new, but the campaign of Donald Trump seemed to at that time be hinging on a really sort of vicious anti-immigrant, anti-refugee rhetoric. Most Americans were getting their information about refugees via what was happening in Syria at that time. But it seemed to me like I hadn't seen as many films that looked at what people are going through when they're in transition. We did end up flying to Beirut and doing some filming with an LGBTQ refugee support group that the UN and the American mission and some folks in Lebanon were putting together. And that infused the film to some extent. But I think when we met the folks that we were meeting, we wanted to make the film as much about what that is to be in limbo, what that is to be in transition. And all of, people think, oh, you get to the United States either on a student visa or you get refugee status and then you land in this promised land of San Francisco. Especially as a queer person, it's like a history of incredible LGBT, liberation. And you think, wow, my
easy.
answer, yeah, exactly. And of course the challenges just start, and that really ended up being the narrative that our film took. So
Fantastic. So I'll start fielding some of the questions that the audience has. And this is from Katie, who says, thank you so much for sharing this beautiful film with us. I am curious how you found the subjects to follow for the film, which we just addressed. Then we have an anonymous attendee who wanted to know how you took care of yourself while hearing and analyzing and sending the messages of these heartbreaking stories. What self-care routine do you have as a filmmaker and researcher in these spaces?
I mean, that's a great question. I think when you're in the middle of producing and you're sort of, comparing your own situation and your own privilege to the folks that you're working with who are, the stakes are pretty high for them sharing their stories and being as vulnerable as they were. You don't really think about that. But the truth is, of course, I think there was some transference. And I was thinking, my co-producer, Jen Gilliman, and I are just a little younger than than the age of the parents of the folks that we followed. And almost to a person, queer refugees and asylum seekers experience trauma, serious trauma, if not torture, at the hands of their own family. And that's what's really sort of unique about the experiences of queer refugees. I mean, it's difficult for any refugee from any community, but most refugees, the refugee resettlement system in this country, in the US, has always been predicated on families. So, you know, a family, for example, will flee a war-torn zone of Iraq. And if they come to the Bay Area where I live, they're immediately connected into the diaspora of people from their own country. And it might be a community center, it might be a mosque, it might be even just a grocery store. It might be referrals to lawyers if you're an asylum seeker that have worked with members of your own family or your community. And it's not easy by any means, but people can get their initial toeholds or their footholds into the culture. If you're a queer Iraqi guy and you arrive in the Bay Area, quite possibly the last person that you might want to ever see are other Iraqis, because perceived or not, you're worried that you're going to experience that same vitriol. So this is a little bit of a roundabout answer to this question, but I think what was heartbreaking to Jen and me is to see how isolated these folks were in their first weeks and months. And they were at much higher risk for repetition of trauma. And I think because we were getting to know them right at that time, we were in some ways a kind of de facto, I'm not going to say psychologist, but we were just, you know, what we do in our work is just we listen actively. And to, you know, to the question of the viewer here, that is sometimes hard. Like, we would go home at night and I think need to sort of just process all of those stories that we were metabolizing. But compared to what their own lived experiences, that's nothing. And, you know, we of course were inspired to just continue and build those relationships with them. So.
Thank you for that, Tom. I think a follow-up question that goes very nicely into this active listening that you're talking about is from another attendee who wants to know how you made sure that your portrayal of these stories did justice to the subjects and to their own voices, and that it wasn't, I guess, really through your eyes or gatekeeping in a way, but it was truly their lived experiences.
Yeah, I mean, this is a brilliant, insightful question, and it gets to the heart of what we do as documentary filmmakers. And there's always a dynamic between filmmakers, regardless of what their own kind of status is in society, but of this sort of storyteller and subject. And I actually like to refer to subjects in our films as participants. So the other hat that I wear is I teach a program where I am now in Colorado called the Youth Documentary Academy. And we work with young kind of high school age kids who are from kind of really diverse, and I would say in many ways underrepresented backgrounds, and really like just try and help sort of mentor, facilitate they themselves kind of locating their own voice, their own access point to story, and then the skills to be able to tell them. And so, as to the extent possible, I like to think about the relationships as collaborative. And also, I think, I mean, the way we try and in some ways mitigate the question here is to spend a long time developing trust and developing rapport, and just making sure that the participants are in it fully, and not like, oh, we're swooping down to do this quick piece or this hit piece or this, you know, whatever it is, particularly given that there's a lot of what we might call sort of trauma porn that sort of comes in sometimes to the documentary space. So I think that's, you know, that's just not the vantage point that I've had. You know, usually the films that we do take, you know, between 3 and 5 years, because we really do want to make sure that they feel like they're owning their stories as we're telling it, and sharing with them cuts along the way, sharing with them our own views of what we're seeing and trying. But I think it's a really good and kind of open-ended question. I think any documentary filmmaker that you talk to is probably going to have maybe a different orientation to that question.
Thank you. One of our professors who actually works a lot in the field asks how, Diane Mazarana, I should say, asks that she has worked on several asylum cases in the US with sexual and gender minorities. And she finds that it's very difficult to win an asylum case, especially in the case of men. So she acknowledges that you do cover the fact that 70% of asylum seekers are denied their asylum claim. But do you happen to know what that breakdown looks like for sexual and gender minorities?
I don't, because the Department of Homeland Security doesn't publish that data. And if we look at sort of on the refugee side too, once refugees come through the United Nations and they get connected to what are called voluntary organizations and resettlement organizations, that data is also not collected. So if you look to a couple of the NGOs in the space, one that we worked with very closely is ORAM, so Organization of Refuge and Asylum and Migration. They are the closest to trying to sort of capture some of those numbers and statistics, but I wouldn't be able to give you an accurate breakdown on that. I will say that in places like the Bay Area of California, in places like New York, even in places like Minneapolis, where there's quite a history of kind of refugee resettlement and maybe more awareness of asylum, probably the asylum officers that you're going to get for your interviews are going to be much more attuned to the nuances of discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And sure enough, I mean, informally talking with a lot of the asylum officers that I met in San Francisco, a lot of them themselves are members of the LGBTQ community. And so whether it's an asylum interview or whether your case initially is pending or gets denied and you have to appeal and go to an immigration judge, you're going to be much better shape if you're a queer person and you're in San Francisco. I mean, it's kind of obvious to say that, but I will say that in those regions, if you talk with the agencies that are representing and doing pro bono asylum adjudication for queer people, they'll tell you that their track records are very, very good, that the approval ratings are much higher than the average.
Thank you. Yes. And I think that this actually goes very well into a question that I had, because one of the most striking parts of the film for me is when Subi is getting ready to speak before the UN Security Council. And as he's picking out his outfit and is deciding on whether to wear his earring or not, he says, "I am gay and I have to look gay." And as you know, too often asylum seekers that have been denied asylum in the US, they're denied that asylum not based on anything but some crazy standards and ideas of Western homosexuality that exist. So I was wondering how much of this quote unquote need to appear gay did you witness while directing the film, and how impactful was it for you knowing that the burden of proof is being demanded of people who have spent their entire lives having to hide who they are to survive?
It's a really good question. And I think probably there are, others in the field. I think about Oasis Legal Services based in the Bay Area who predominantly represent LGBTQ asylum seekers. I think about Immigration Equality, which is a national organization based in New York. And they're going to have more informed, I think, responses to this. But what I can tell you, in having been in the space for a few years, is that was rarely an issue that LGBTQ asylum seekers or refugees were concerned about. But again, what I was saying earlier, they're in a region, they're going before Homeland Security or ICE immigration in places where folks, don't carry the same kind of antiquated stereotypes of what it means to be gay or lesbian or bi or trans. There's just more awareness of that. I will say, I remember Cheyenne and Marie, you see a couple scenes in the film where they're preparing for their asylum interview. And this would come up a little bit in a kind of funny, amusing way that they're like, well, Marie's going to present, as a dyke, there's just no way. But what about Cheyenne? And Cheyenne was like, do you think I should, cut my hair? Do you think I should wear clothes? And so I think it's a real fear and concern that people have. Are people going to read me as who I am? And in fact, in the early case law, I remember doing research in some of the early cases that involved gay men with AIDS and sort of gender nonconforming men from Mexico who were applying for asylum, back in the late 80s and 90s and stuff. You saw in the case law literature there, like some quotes from some of the judges. It was like clear that they did not know, like if you appeared sort of straight looking or, kind of masculine, then the judge is potentially going to, turn you down, because I'm not hearing so much of that. And that certainly wasn't the case in any of the folks that we kind of connected with around the time of the film. But I think it's an interesting question.
Well, thank you. Yes, I remember doing some research myself and seeing in some of the rulings things like, how can she really be a lesbian? She doesn't even know who Oscar Wilde is. And you just, it's things like this, or this person hasn't had a partner in forever long. How can they truly say they belong to LGBTQ community? So it's good to hear that that's not something that you had to come across much. Unfortunate to know that it's not something that we're seeing throughout the country. But hopefully San Francisco is shining a way forward in this. We have two other questions. What do you think is needed to make the asylum adjudication process in the US more accommodating of sexual and gender minorities seeking asylum, and better at guaranteeing safe resettlement for those who are granted asylum? And what are the most pressing areas? Legislative, adjudicator training, education of judges, etc. This is from Nick Kitchinelli.
Nick, yes, and yes, like all those things you clearly are in this space and know. I think just, kind of as a segue from our last question, I think doing those trainings, like we've even thought that that the film itself, and in fact, a couple months after we had our world premiere in San Francisco, the ICE department in San Francisco that does adjudication asked us to come and do a screening for its asylum officers. So what an amazing thing for an officer to be able to stand in the shoes of those folks who are coming through the system, and what those issues are that they're wrestling with, and what those unique experiences are to queer people. So of course, I think that would be a great thing. And in fact, just a few weeks ago, we did an event that was with law school professors, and we developed a kind of a law school study guide. So if you go to unsettled.film, you can, right on the front page, we put it up there for now. We developed this pretty extensive viewer's guide that I think might be a good way to sort of spark discussion in the context of adjudication. So it really is meant for an audience of law students, of people who are working in asylum clinics, of pro bono coordinators, those folks within law firms that refer cases to their lawyers and their firm and stuff. And I would urge you to take a look at that. I think more broadly, yes, legislation. I mean, we can't really have this conversation without acknowledging that in the last 4 years, the asylum system and the refugee system, as it relates to the United States, has been desiccated. So just to give you an example, I think there were 120, the cap on refugees when Obama left office was somewhere around 115, 120,000, which is a little higher than the average. I mean, the US has historically been up there in the countries that will accept refugees. And by the end of Trump's presidency, it was down to about 15,000. And many of Trump's advisors around immigration wanted to do away with refugees. So that rhetoric that I talked about earlier that really allowed Trump to rise, politically, they really followed through on that if you look at it. And the asylum protocols, particularly on the border for Central American families who are coming up, it became almost impossible for an asylum seeker to even have their day in court at the US-Mexican border because of the new migration protocols there. So, and it's not just, you can't just be President Biden and snap your fingers. I mean, he has basically indicated that he wants to get those levels, those refugee levels back up to over 125,000, but that's not going to happen overnight, because you think about the ripple effect of this kind of policy. All the refugee resettlement organizations were in dire straits the last few years. They lost support, they lost funding, they lost infrastructure, they lost their relationships to those federal organizations. So it's going to take a while, but I'm hopeful, given what President Biden is talking about. And I think absolutely to be able to engage your congressmen and women and senators and really, I think Biden has indicated that immigration is a really important issue right at the get-go. So this is a ripe time to be able to include refugees and asylum adjudication in that conversation and make sure it doesn't get lost in it.
Certainly. No, thank you. And it's amazing to think that, yes, the roof was 15,000 when he left, and it wasn't even met, because that was the ceiling, but there were so many policies put in place to make sure that those 15,000 were not even able to come in. On that point, I was wondering if you had kept in touch with Suvi, and I know that he founded a nonprofit Spectra project, and I guess that was taken on by Orem, which you were talking about earlier. And if you have been keeping up with him or with any of the other people that you interviewed through the process, whether for the film or even as you were thinking about who to include, is there anything new that you learned about the plight of LGBTQ asylum seekers and refugees that you wish you would have known prior to undertaking this project?
Right. And I should just say too, if my microphone starts to degrade my voice and I start to sound like ghoulish, it does sometimes happen about 45 minutes into a Zoom meeting. So just put your hand up and I'll unplug and you'll still be able to hear me. But yeah, I mean, you can't, I think, sort of wade into the waters that deeply and for that long and not become pretty close to the participants that you work with. And I'm happy to say that, I feel like very close friendships have evolved and continue to exist with all four of the refugees and asylum seekers. And Subi started this organization, Spectra Project, which you can go spectraproject.org, which again has just, I think, merged with ORAM, the organization I talked about earlier. But it was really amazing to watch Subi kind of take his own lived experience of the years and turn that into, like, because he knows intimately so well what it is like to be particularly in transit, to have to go to a transit country. So for him, from going from Syria first to Lebanon and then to Turkey, and the ways in which you feel really vulnerable as a queer person, even in places that might ostensibly be a little more sensitive or supportive for LGBTQ people. He basically started an organization that was about getting support directly, like humanitarian emergency support, housing support, counseling, to those very folks that are taking those first steps out of their home countries. And Oram is continuing that work in an amazing way. Shine and Marie, I'm happy to say, are doing very, very well. Once they got their asylum status, they fled San Francisco. They were tired of spending 75% of their income on rent, which of course is becoming so ridiculous in the Bay Area. And so they first moved to Las Vegas, and then just a few months ago have moved to Salt Lake City, and I think are very happy. They've traveled with the film. They came to Colorado Springs, where I am now, and we presented the film to the Rocky Mountain Women's Film Festival, surprised the audience with them. And despite cold, which is not something they're used to in Angola, they really, really like it. And of course, Salt Lake City is similar. And they're working on their music. And Cheyenne has recorded a couple of amazing cuts of songs, and Marie does a lot of the producing and stuff. So it's really neat to just see them actually circle back to some of the things that they were really successful in Luanda, Angola. They were successful performers. They had an audience there. They had their own popsicle business. They were quite successful. So it's important to realize that, it's people often, when they make that, sort of amazing choice to actually leave, they're often giving up many things. And that was certainly the case with them. But I'm really inspired by how they're being able to get back to their music and performing. And Junior, I'm also happy to say, was able to get a public housing stipend, and more recently, another, I don't know if it's state-based, but another support for getting more housing. He's not living in San Francisco anymore. He's living a little bit south of there, but I think is starting to have a little more stability around the basic housing. And I know he's really keen on getting a paralegal degree and working in law and working specifically with LGBTQ people and immigration and stuff. So it's nice to see them all kind of moving forward.
That's so fantastic to hear. Um, yeah, because towards the end of the film, you don't know what's really going to happen with Junior. So it's really awesome to have that closure and to know that he's doing so much better. Another question from the audience is, have you shown the film internationally, and how has it been received? Is the reception different in different places?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have shown it, yes, and I wish I could say that I was in many of those places, but it is shown in a number of sort of European LGBTQ film festivals and human rights festivals. I was able to attend one in Sweden, and it was really interesting because we had a gay asylum seeker who was kind of in the midst of his petition, and a woman who hadn't yet. And it was really interesting to see the differences and to understand there are a number of particularly Northern European countries who provide a lot more concrete material support, whether it's a benefit, a sort of a refugee benefit or a living benefit that's certainly much more realistic than what the US provides. I mean, the US provides none to asylum seekers, but and the film has shown in India, in Hong Kong, and some other places more recently, and I haven't yet gotten kind of anecdotal feedback. And I would be really interested in knowing. We showed the film in Prague at an international queer rights conference that was going on, and that was really interesting because we had people from many different countries, and they, I think they related to the persecution and the backstories kind of uniformly, but the ways in which the different countries where they were settling all had a really different flavor with, many different dimensions based on that country's policy to, around newcomers. So
That's fantastic. I wonder if there is something that you are rarely asked when doing these film talks that you would like to have the space to bring up about either the filmmaking process when you have these documentaries where you're trying to shed some light into, as you say, vilified populations and issues, or even just very particularly about the LGBTQ asylum and refugee situation in San Francisco.
yeah, well, I did just think of one other piece to that last question, which is that Cheyenne has mentioned in the last two Q&As, people have asked, like, have you shown your family the film? Has the film been shown in Luanda, Angola, or in the Congo in the case of Junior? And it hasn't, but Cheyenne's father, who I think is maybe even connected with government in Angola, knows about the film and has sort of indicated to her in the last months that he and the whole family really want to see the film. So that would be amazing. And I could actually imagine working with an NGO to show the film there. I think it would be really difficult to show the film in Syria for obvious reasons right now. But in terms of that question, or just sort of chewing on, I mean, one thing when people ask what they can do, and of course for the sort of the students who are out there and faculty, and particularly those who might be interested in going to law school, you don't have to be an expert in immigration law. You don't have to be an immigration attorney to file a petition on behalf of an asylum seeker. And a lot of the pro bono attorneys in San Francisco, and there are many of them, like the woman who represented China Marie in the film, she did corporate and international law for Cooley Law Firm. She herself was an immigrant from the Philippines and went to law school in San Francisco at UC Hastings. But so she had, affinity she had connection to the issue. She could really empathize and understand what Cheyenne and Marie were going through, but that wasn't her background. And what she did as a pro bono attorney, and granted, she got a lot of material support from the firm who supports their pro bono attorneys, but she basically, that was a game changer for Cheyenne and Marie. So imagining that you could, if you're an attorney or if you're a law school student and maybe you're working in an asylum clinic or you're interested, you can really potentially save someone's life. And so that's a question that we get and people don't realize. And then I would just say also, like, there are all these NGOs that are doing great work. There's the legislative stuff that we talked about. There's the connecting asylum seekers to lawyers, but what I guess one of my big takeaways is, how important it is to just befriend refugees and asylum seekers when they're coming, and especially LGBTQ ones. As we talked about before, they're not going to as easily sort of slide into the infrastructures or frameworks that exist for non-queer refugees. And just like, volunteering to take a refugee out for coffee, or maybe in those what sort of seem like kind of banal first things, like going to the DMV and getting a driver's license, or going to a local housing office. Just, I think people have a huge hunger for companionship and friendship, and for most of their lives, their strategy for surviving in those home countries is to push down who they really are. And so it was lovely in our film to see queer people in San Francisco start to understand, like, oh, wait a minute, there are these folks that are really kind of hanging out there alone and need camaraderie, as well as these, of course, they need housing, of course, they need employment opportunities, but I can't sort of won't overemphasize the need to just connect and build friendship and relationships. And I think maybe that's one thing we were able to do a little bit as a byproduct of our film, is just connect with folks.
And I would hope too that, given the current situation that we're living in with the pandemic, and how there are so many people who have found themselves in isolation, who never experienced anything like this, right? They're born and raised in the US, they know their communities, they have never been persecuted, they've lived a life of privilege otherwise, and all of a sudden have only seen their partner or their roommates for the past year. If maybe that too will call upon us to be a better community member, and community in the grander sense of the word, to really appreciate and see that there are so many people that, for a number of circumstances, find themselves in isolation regularly. And that, as you said, I mean, that doesn't take away from all of the structural issues that we must address, but that sometimes at our daycare, we had a kindness week, and the kindness is free, and kindness is truly free, and that you can just be kind and show that kindness, and embrace those around us, especially those who are new and have no one else to turn to.
Well, so
it's a wonderful message.
I'm definitely getting goosebumps as you talk there, and I think it's right to wonder if, like, one of the silver linings of this time is that people are reconnecting with some of those basic ethics of kind of kindness, and how so yes, yeah, thank you for sharing that.
No, I hope so. And aside from the actual production and direction of the film, would you have any advice for researchers that maybe they don't have the legal background, or are not going to pursue that, but are just in the field carrying out research with vulnerable populations, given that this has been a space for you too? What advice do you think you could give to us all?
It was really inspiring to me to start to see a kind of burgeoning literature, academic literature, around LGBTQ plus refugees, and studies that folks were starting to do to look at these real unique experiences, and some of the isolation, and the ways in which people do or don't get sort of plugged into the resources that they need at kind of every stage of the process. I remember I'm forgetting the academic team that did this, but they looked at every stage of refugee, from making the choice to leave, to connecting with the United Nations, to moving to a country of transit, to going through the interviewing process through the UN, and then ultimately resettling, and all the ways in which that takes a toll on people, and also looking at resilience and resiliency in those communities. But I do think it's worth looking at some of the vulnerable communities of people also who've experienced domestic abuse, which I think has only been amplified in COVID, and also kids in asylum seeking families, and the ways that sometimes, or refugee kids. We were able to go on a sidebar trip when we were traveling to Beirut, we were able to go to Greece and look at a school that Americans and Europeans were setting up to teach Syrian refugee kids, because folks were landing in these refugee camps, and instead of staying for 2 or 3 months, given the refugee crisis, they're basically staying for years, and refugee camps are turning into small towns. And yet they don't have grants for schools. They don't have a federal government of the refugee camp to provide, structured education. And so I think for academics to just maybe be attuned to some of those members of communities who are a little bit more vulnerable or underrepresented in the traditional literature of refugees and asylum seekers would be really valuable.
Certainly. And how is it, and I know that you touched upon this, but what you just said brought it back. And I was wondering if you could talk about it just a little bit more to close. What was it within, whether it was your journalism experience, your radio experience, or even within your filmmaking experience, that made it clear to you that you had the ability and the art and the talent to have this platform and to lend this platform to so many who have a voice but have been unheard? And how did it click for you that you had to kind of relinquish the power that platform provided you to them, and how to do that effectively? What happened that clicked for you?
Great question. There are two answers. One is just really pragmatic, which is that, so many worthy documentaries about sort of untold stories don't get funded, or maybe don't get completed because there just isn't nearly enough funding for them. And we feel really fortunate that the independent television service, which is sort of the funding arm of the nonfiction funding arm of PBS and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, saw this as a really important and kind of underrepresented, underestimated sort of story. And so being able to have that kind of support and not be, not having to like put, production shoots on my credit cards and not having to go into debt, which is not uncommon if you talk to a lot of documentary filmmakers who are fierce in their passion to tell their stories, but ultimately you've got to have support for what you do. So we feel really lucky that there were also donors, that we were able to make the case to a number of folks, both queer and non-queer, philanthropists, that this was a story that most Americans didn't know, and that we needed to get it out there. So I think there's that level. And then the level of sort of getting out of the way is, something we teach our kids, our students in the Youth Documentary Academy, is so much of what you're doing as a documentary director is you're orchestrating. You want to bring out all the talents of the team. It's a very collaborative, despite, what you sort of read or hear in Hollywood about the sort of auteur, that there's one person responsible for a vision. It's in documentary, it's even less so. It's so collaborative. And really your job is to inspire those around you to also be really active listeners. And when you have that, and you have agreement from your subjects, yes, I'm willing to share this with you. I'm being very vulnerable, and I trust you with this material, that you're going to treat it sensitively. Once you have all those sort of stars aligning, it's a pretty magical thing. I mean, it's just, you set up lights, you turn the camera on, and you're listening to be able to hold people's stories. And it's it's something I feel really lucky to have been able to do over the course of 20, 25 years. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And we actually just got one last question in. And this is from a also faculty professor who has had the joys of experiencing filmmaking as well. And she, Katrina Burgess, would like to know, do you have a next project in mind? And would you like to continue working on related issues surrounding, migration and LGBTQ people?
Yeah, great question. I don't have a new feature film in the works. This one was quite an odyssey and kind of a long period as well. So that project that I mentioned in Greece is a short project, and my film partner Jen is directing that, about teaching Syrian kids and Syrian refugees families there. And so that's something that I'll probably help her shore up. And it's really interesting. I think, there's some filmmakers who have sort of drilled into a particular space. And, for instance, I have colleagues who've made films about LGBTQ lives and experiences and oppression and voices over the course of decades. And I'll tell you, one of the benefits of that, aside from just, deepening the connection into those issues and the knowledge that you get from doing many projects, is that you have a sort of base of support. You can go back to the same executive producers, you can go back to the same funders, and they see, wow, this is just a continuation of a narrative around these very important issues. And I, for whatever reason, have not done that. I kind of started with a film about gays in the Boy Scouts, and then, sort of flung over and did a film about the kind of untold stories of Jehovah's Witnesses and their experience in the Supreme Court and their opposition to kind of Nazi fascism in Germany. And then I, went from there to like kids in science and the National Science Talent Search. And so, some of my funders of those previous projects would be sort of like, I don't know. I don't really see the overall narrative here. And partly it's just because I was drawn to those stories because of some personal connection or just interest. And I have to say, it's been an interesting life, just as a sort of curious generalist. I think each time you do one of those films, it's like a little bit of a mini thesis project or dissertation, and you learn an incredible amount. And then I kind of like going on to something else and bring that, that basic knowledge to something new. But yeah, there's certainly value in all of those trajectories, and I think that the common denominator is looking for an untold story and kind of bringing that wisdom, forward to each new project.
Your microphone is starting to do the thing that you warned us it would do, and I know I had said that it was the last question, and I apologize. This is going to be the last question. Did you notice an increase in interest and advocacy of immigration and asylum cases during the Trump administration? And now, is there a fear that some of that engagement will go away because most people think Biden will, quote unquote, fix it? And how does this kind of engagement change across administrations when people feel like they need to be more involved because the government isn't representing perhaps their priorities, versus people thinking that they can just kind of relinquish their power and let government officials do the rest?
Yeah, I mean, that is a really great and insightful question. And I think I sort of started this conversation talking about the complacency that I was really feeling in progressive and queer communities in the Bay Area at the end of the Obama administration. So I think definitely that is a legitimate fear. I will say that the asylum rights and the refugee resettlement and rights communities have been so dramatically desiccated in this last administration that they are, there's a ferocity, there's a hunger to move through and to pass, and to bring up legislation. And I think when Biden signaled that immigration is a priority, like right out of the gate, I just see, and again, this is just anecdotally, I'm just looking at my social media and all the partners that we've made with groups like HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, with all the folks that are doing this important work, are feeling really energized. So I don't see it that complacency happening right away, but absolutely. I mean, that's the course of history. If you don't watch what's going on, I mean, I think, the example of the last 4 years, we can all see, what's possible in a democratic society. And I guess I would just say one more thing about that, which is, those changes in policies, I don't think I don't think he cared about any of that except what is going to satisfy my base. And it had, of course, real impact on individual refugees who are waiting, from countries of transit to come, of families who were coming up to the border, and we saw what happened with all of that. But it also had a larger impact symbolically on what the US is able to do in terms of foreign policy and its leverage power Like when we shift a policy like that, and then we go to an autocratic country and we want to try and leverage that country to increase its democratic impulses, it's really kind of hard to do that when our own policies have kind of fallen by the wayside. So I guess my greatest hope is that as we begin to repair some of the foreign policy in the US, that these new shifts and new policies around asylum and refugees are going to be able to embolden and empower our ability, to be a strong partner in the world.
Yeah, to regain soft power, right?
Exactly, diplomatic
Yeah.
power.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Tom. It has truly been a pleasure having you. Thank you for allowing us to share your film with the Fletcher community. I know personally it was impactful, and I think you did a phenomenal job of really narrowing in on what the reality of LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers is in such an expensive city, and with such a strong cultural shock to what their new reality is. So thank you for that. Thank you for continuing to make these documentaries, and we very much look forward to everything that you come out with next. We'll be on the lookout.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for, tuning in to this really thoughtful conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for participating. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.